Hello, and welcome back to Many Adventures Mini. So, this week I decided I wanted to break things up and do something different. This is a project that I've been wanting to start tackling and learning and improving on the techniques for a long time, and I finally got around to getting started on it this week. So instead of painting a miniature this week, I decided to build a little medieval townhouse cottage building to be used for D&D games and wargaming. And it's something I've been wanting to work on for a long time, and this was my first attempt really jumping into it after having watched a lot of videos online, and I think it came out pretty good for my first attempt. So I want to share that with you here. My quick kind of preface disclaimer here is that most, if not all, of the techniques that I use in this project today are ones that I learned from watching Black Magic Craft. I believe I've mentioned that YouTube channel before. I'll leave a link to his main page down in the description. But I learned a lot and I really enjoy watching his videos, so if you like this kind of thing, go check out his channel as well. He has a lot more on the subject than I do. But since this is a long video, I'm going to go ahead and we'll jump into the crafting and painting so that you can see everything that I did. Alright, so here we are jumping in. Here I am marking out some basic measurements here on a piece of foam core board. It's the same kind of foam board that you often see being used for like school projects and whatnot, for posting up all that information. There's two kinds. This kind doesn't have easily removable paper. That's another brand that I also occasionally use, but I didn't want that for this because this is going to be the substructure for my house. So I cut it out roughly to be about 2.5 inches tall, short of the roof, and then just kind of eyeballed the roof from there. And then the short sides are about 4 inches long, the long sides are 6 inches long. And I didn't really account for the thickness of the foam increasing the thickness, the length overall. I didn't think it really mattered too much, so I just left it like that. But I assembled them using some hot glue as well as some push pins for additional stability. And then here you can see I'm kind of just using the roof section as a guide to cut myself out a little section here out of some medium weight chipboard that I'm going to be using for my roofing section. And I do this just because it's thinner, so it will leave less of a noticeable mark once I start adding additional features on top. And I just bend those a little bit to match the curvature I made in my template and go on. Attaching with hot glue. And then here I'm showing you, this is my Proxxon table. This is the tool that I use for cutting up all of my foam bits, and I'm not really going to show that most of the time just because it's fairly tedious and you don't need to see all of it. But using one of those thin cut pieces of foam, it's an XPS construction foam used for insulation. I just use a WizKids door and fill it in there as a template to make one out of that, and it's a pretty simple process. I also used the Proxxon for cutting out these bricks, and I'm just doing a double layer of bricks around the base of the house here, just attaching it with some PVA glue. These bricks are 1/4 by 1/4 inch, and on the long side they're a 1/2 inch. So that's the dimensions I went with for these bricks. I think that they're a pretty good size, so that's the size I typically go with. Got to be careful while attaching these to try and keep your lines straight. But it's a pretty simple process. Just brush on some glue, lay down your bricks. This makes a nice looking foundation for the house to be sitting on, and I think it works out pretty well. And then I've got my little door that I made there. I get the door texture just by using a wire brush and running it along with the grain of the XPS foam. And then I used a pencil to just get the deeper lines for the board marks. And I just kind of like eyeballed it. I used the little WizKids door as just a template to help me get my sizing and everything the way I wanted. And then I cut some bricks in half here to run around the door as my door frame, since I didn't want to do like a wooden door frame. I kind of liked the way that this looked. And then I have some 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch area bits of foam here that I have textured with wood, and I'm just kind of cutting a corner out of it with the knife so that it lays over the edge of the house at about half thickness, since that's the thickness I typically want to go with for most of my boards when filling in the rest of the wooden sections that I'll have on this house. So I just kind of get a longer stick that's been fully textured and then just hold it up to the area I want to stick it in just to get my sizing, and basically just tick it with the knife at the length that I want so that I get the right length just about every time. It's not exactly perfect, but it works well enough in this application that I didn't see any reason to change it. And then I take some only like 1/8 inch, I believe that's the right math, thick boards that are also textured for wood grain with the same wire brush method, and I just lay those out like here, just kind of framing in the walls. And here I wanted to show you, this is a technique I used for getting some window shutters. I just took a very thin piece of this XPS foam, and I just took a small sharpened pencil and started carving in the details here. And you can see that they're a little rough and ragged, but since I was going for kind of a middle of the road, poor medieval house, I thought it might make sense for the window sills to be a little bit ragged, so I decided I liked it and left it like that. So I make a couple of those and attach them at roughly the same points on the sides of the house. I did measure that out just so that I would have them even, and then I frame them in with a wooden frame, as you can see here. Again, just placing a longer piece in, fitting it, cutting it almost on the building just to get it the right length, and putting everything in. And I'm using the same technique just to get these diagonal boards. I place it so that the ends are sitting where I will want them, and then I just place the knife over, and I get the right angle every time. I had to find my center point here. I just did this by roughly holding a pencil up from the center point to the roof down to the bottom and just marking that spot. And it's close enough that I haven't really run into any issues, so I just leave it like that. And I just continue around hitting each side of the house. It's slightly different here on the front as well, since I'm getting it in next to the door. Just gluing everything in place. And then here is my next step, where I am taking some unsanded tile grout, which I've mixed into roughly paste-like consistency here. And with this, you can see I messed up a lithere bit there and got it somewhere I didn't want to. And I just clean that up as best as I can. At this point, it's more or less water soluble, so I was able to get it down to a fairly good consistency. But once I fill in all of these sections with this liquid pasty tile grout, just trying to clean it up a little bit there, get everything even, I take some dry tile grout powder and just sprinkle that on the top to give it some texture and dry out the surface a little bit. It helps the surface dry out more so that it's a bit more stiff and easier to work with. And then I move on to this other side here, and I also then find that if I brush it off, because I was trying to clean it off of my wood piles there, I get some nice texture there with the wood. And then I only do those sides so far. I decide to move on to working on the roofing shingles for this house. So this is another Blackmagic craft technique. Again, I took a strip of XPS foam and cut it so that I got all of those interesting shingle textures in there. And once I had that, I textured it with a wood grain with a wire brush before cutting a very thin slice off. And so that let me get several long strips of shingles. They're all like the same pattern of shingles, but as long as you stagger them, like you can see me doing, that doesn't really become all that readily apparent. I do have to do this a couple times because I keep running out of material going through here. So it's kind of like difficult to get it all in like one go, but it's a steady process, and it's a lot faster and easier than trying to attach individual shingles all the way up the roof. That is definitely possible, but it's a lot more time consuming. So this was the method I went with. It gets the lion's share of the work done nice and quick without having to worry too much about getting everything, every little bit down and detailed and whatnot. And then for the capstones here, or just the roof peak bits, I just took some thicker pieces and wood grained them and stuck them on the top. If I did this in the future, I'd probably use hot glue to stick it down because I had a little bit of trouble getting it to stick with the other glue. And then I just take my X-Acto knife and cut all the excess off of the edge of the roof. And I did that because I wanted to finish up this little section here, trying to get my roof beams up so that it covers the shingles. This didn't go exactly how I wanted it to. I'm going to have to tweak how I do this in the future. These beams came on and they were like a bit too thick, so I shaved them down a little bit and retextured them. I have to do the same thing on this side because, again, I didn't learn from doing it on the one side, and I have to shave it down and make it thicker. And then I'm continuing on working with my tile grout, just getting everything filled in and then throwing some dry stuff on to texture it and get that kind of like old, partially decaying plaster look that I would potentially expect to see from like a medieval fantasy town. So that's just kind of what I'm going for. I had more trouble with these little areas this little area underneath the window that I had to fill in on both sides. I had a little bit more trouble with that than I originally thought I would, but it wasn't too bad in the end. But yeah, it's a really simple technique, and putting an excess of it on here, this dry powder, and then brushing it away and tamping it down, almost kind of solidifies the side enough that you can move it around and not have it shift very much. So it lets me get just about all the sides more or less at once without having to worry too much. I also had to periodically rehydrate my tile grout as I was working with it, as it started drying out and turning into almost more like a peanut butter consistency instead of like a pasty consistency, which isn't what I wanted. But I just keep going through and putting it in like that. This is really dusty stuff. Be careful working with it. You might want to work with a mask if you do, because it's such a fine powder. And what you can see me doing here is this is some construction paper that I've just eyeballed, cut to a thin amount compared up to my door. And I used a pen to press into it really hard. This gives kind of a rivet-like looking effect on the other side so that I can get kind of a iron banded door look. And here you can see me using a pick tool from my my clay carving set. I was just using it to clean up some of the tile grout before it had completely set. And there I glued on my bindings, and you can see I also have a little doorknob there. I get that because my glue gun tends to drip and leak. So I just took one of the drops that it dripped out on its own and cut the thin end off, and it was like the perfect size and scale for a miniature doorknob. And then after putting the patio on, here's the images after I finish the construction. This is where I've got to let it sit to cure. And I come back here, this is the next day, and I'm painting using my normal technique of going at it very heavily with this primer. I'm going at this much heavier than I would with any model because I want to protect this foam as much as possible in the future. Blackmagic Craft uses Mod Podge to protect all of his foam projects, but I didn't want to potentially lose out on any detail because I think I tend to use it a little bit too thickly. So I just went really heavy with the primer. And if you're doing this, I do not recommend using a rattle can primer or spray can. I only do this with my airbrush because it's just paint and air coming out, but if you use a can, they have additional chemicals in there that will most likely melt your foam if you try to use it on something like that. So I highly recommend avoiding that. Only do this method if you have an airbrush. Otherwise, you're going to either want to paint on primer or, as Blackmagic Craft does, use Mod Podge, probably mixed with black paint so you can see where it all goes. But after that, like you saw, I was using some dark gray paint to get a base coat on my bricks, and I'm using this espresso colored craft paint. I use craft paint when I'm working on terrain projects because they're so much bigger. If I used model paint, the expenses would get pretty ridiculous pretty quickly, as model paints are a lot more expensive. When you're working on a miniature, it's not that big a deal because you're not using that much paint. But I have to go through quite a bit more just for covering like this roof because there's so much surface area, and the texturing I did has left so many little grooves in there that I would go through an entire bottle of my expensive model paint if I tried to use that. So craft paint it is, because it's only like $1 for this whole bottle, and it won't break the bank to use it in this kind of way. But just liberally coating everything in this dark brown espresso color, starting on the roof and then coming down and working on my boards and whatnot. And I'm just trying to be as thorough as I can here. I'm not worrying too much about being a little bit messy and getting it on the plaster. I know I'm going to have to come back and clean that up later no matter what, so it's not a big deal. And I want to make sure I get any of the exposed wood on the sides of the board as well. So that's just what this step is going around, getting as much as possible, going back and hitting areas that I missed. In the future, I think I might go and actually use a darker primer, like maybe a dark gray or a black, instead of this like light gray primer that I normally use. It works great for models, but I think for terrain, I would get more mileage out of a darker starting base color, since it's got so many of these little cracks and crevices that I really struggled to get paint into. And here's my next step once I get a lot of that base coat in. I use this tan color first, and later the wine, and I'm just going across each side of the house and picking out a couple of bricks to paint a different color, just so that it adds a little bit of variation and stands out. There's not really any special technique or methodology to this. It's kind of just like an eyeball and a feel thing. You just want to make sure you don't have too much or too little, and you'll get the effect that you're looking for, most likely. It just is supposed to break things up a little bit, add a little bit more visual interest so it doesn't stay boring. And they stand out a lot right now, but in a little bit they won't stand out nearly as much. And here you can see I'm using this white along with a little bit of suede just to mix together an off-white color, since I didn't have one I liked just laying around. And I just use this to fill in the plaster. And this is a very subtle difference. I just wanted to have a little bit more of that like suede-ish off color on it, not just a pure white or gray on the sides, because I think it's a better color for starting with for where I'm going to be going later. And here I take some of my homemade black wash. I just use this. This is made with a readily available gloss medium, just mixed with some black artist's ink, just to get it to a wash consistency. And I just used the gloss because it was the easiest one for me to find. And after I applied it on the bricks, I let it dry a bit, and then I am coming back with a dark brown sepia ink wash, and I'm applying that pretty much across the entire rest of the house. I'm starting here with the roof and giving it just a very, very generous, almost just soaking in the stuff. And then I come down and I get my boards and plaster on the sides. I get it a little bit out of frame there, but get it back in relatively quickly. And once I put it down, I just take my brush and I go back and soak up the worst of the pools. I want to get everything thoroughly covered, but I think it's a little bit too dark in the recesses, so I soak up the pools so that it's kind of staining everything, but you don't have like these big pools everywhere, and that gives a better effect once everything dries, I think. And I just continue. I do this on each side of the house just to make sure everything is thoroughly coated. I might go back over some sections again at another point just to make sure I get everything stained in case I missed a spot or something. I don't really have to be too careful here. The only thing I need to be careful of is making sure I don't leave any areas that are too heavily filled up. But at this step, I take a slightly lighter gray than I was using before, as well as that suede color I was using, and I just dry brush my bricks. I'm being relatively thorough, and I'm definitely making sure to get as much paint off of my brush as I can before I start this dry brushing. It's a fairly light effect that I'm going for. I don't want to overdo it, but just this light gray and then a bit of the suede really brings out a natural stone color. And it helps blend in those bricks very nicely so that you can still see that they're different, but they match the other bricks around them a lot better. And then I'm just doing the same thing to all of the wood with this golden brown color, just dry brushing it with very, very little paint just to pick up some of the highest points that you see sitting on all of the wood bits. This goes a long way to brightening up the wood while still having it look dark and grungy like the kind of wood it is. And then here I bring in my metallic just because these model metallics are kind of the best for this. I use it for my door pieces, for my iron banding and doorknob. And then the last step is my usual varnish. I actually do 2 or 3 layers of this just to be really sure it's nice and thick and protecting it. And here are the final images. I am really proud of this. There are a few things I could have done better, kind of with that ceiling joint going onto the roofing shingles. I think that could have been a bit better, but I'm still pretty happy with it. So here I'll leave you with an image with some of my other miniatures I've painted just to show for scale, and I'm pretty happy with this one. Alright, I hope you enjoyed that. I had a lot of fun putting this together. There are definitely a few things that I would improve on and change in my technique and maybe my order of operations for how I put stuff together in the future, but overall, I'm reasonably happy with how it came out. And I'd love to try doing something like this in the future. So please go ahead and comment down below. Let me know if this is something you would like to see more of. I'm also interested in potentially selling some of these finished products on my Etsy store eventually, once I get more of my technique down and I like what I've got and think it would be something I could sell. So give me your feedback if you're interested in anything like that, or what kind of thing you would buy if you wanted one, or how much you'd pay for it. It's all information I'm very much interested in. So like I said, if you have anything to say, comment section down below would be awesome. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. It helps out a lot. And if you want to catch any more of my videos in the future, please subscribe and hit the bell icon so that you get notified whenever any of my videos go live. And if you would like to try supporting me outside of purchasing any of the products I put up on my Etsy store, you can also take a look at my Patreon page, which I will have linked down in the description as well. And with that, I hope to see everybody here again next week.